What if the key to unlocking your future lies in remembering your past and making a bold commitment today? In this episode, we explore Deuteronomy, where Moses gives his final speeches to the Israelites, reminding them of God's faithfulness and urging them to choose obedience in the Promised Land. It's a powerful call to remember, reflect, and commit. How do these ancient principles guide us today in our choices and our relationship with God? Let's dive into the book that's all about covenant renewal and faithful living.
Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going deep today into an ancient book, Deuteronomy, using some excerpts from Deuteronomy, a call to covenant faithfulness, loving and obeying God.
Yeah, this book, it's really amazing how much wisdom is packed into it, even though it was written thousands of years ago.
I know, it's crazy to think about, right?
Yeah.
Like imagine standing with the Israelites right on the plains of Moab.
About to cross into the Promised Land.
Exactly, after 40 years of wandering.
40 years?
Can you imagine that feeling? Like all that anticipation relief, maybe even some disbelief. And then you're listening to Moses, your leader, deliver his final address.
Wow, talk about pressure.
I know, right? So what's fascinating to me is that Deuteronomy isn't just a farewell speech.
It's so much more than that.
It's this powerful call to covenant renewal.
Yeah.
A chance for the Israelites to recommit to their relationship with God.
Right, it's like hitting the reset button.
Yeah,
you know?
Totally. And you know what really struck me is how much Deuteronomy emphasizes God's faithfulness to his people. Even when let's just say they weren't always the best followers.
They had their moments.
Yeah, they did. But even despite their repeated failures, God never wavered in his commitment.
That's so encouraging, isn't it?
It really is. It's like a reminder that God's love and promises aren't dependent on our perfection.
He's faithful no matter what.
Absolutely. So we've got this idea of covenant faithfulness as kind of the foundation.
Yeah.
But then the source material also brings in these themes of love and obedience.
Yeah, they're really intertwined.
Exactly. It even specifically mentions the Shema, that central prayer in the Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
Powerful words.
So powerful. It really connects those ideas of love and obedience, showing how one flows from the other.
It's not about just blindly following rules out of fear.
Right. It's about this deep love for God that motivates us to live our lives according to his will.
It makes you think about your own actions, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, what's driving you? Is it obligation, fear, or genuine love? That's a challenge this ancient text throws at us even today.
It definitely makes you think.
And speaking of challenging figures, let's talk about Moses.
Oh yeah, he's a key player in all of this.
He plays such a complex role in Deuteronomy. I mean, he's not just a leader.
He's a prophet, a teacher, a mediator between God and the people.
And all of this while knowing he won't even be entering the Promised Land himself.
Can you imagine the weight of that?
It just adds this whole other layer of, poignancy to his words.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how Moses, in a lot of ways, foreshadows the role of Christ.
Oh, wow.
Both acting as mediators, leading their people towards the Promised Land.
Both delivering a message of hope and challenge.
Powerful stuff.
It really makes you think about the qualities of a good leader, doesn't it? The kind of qualities that stand the test of time.
Humility, courage, a willingness to sacrifice for the good of others.
Yeah, exactly. Do those qualities resonate with you?
They definitely do. And, Deuteronomy doesn't shy away from the consequences of our choices either. It lays out a very clear path. Obedience leads to blessings. Rebellion leads to curses.
Straightforward, right. And the text gets pretty specific about those consequences too, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like abundant crops, peace, victory, versus things like famine, defeat, and even exile.
It's a pretty stark choice.
It is. It makes you wonder how those ancient pronouncements of blessing and curses apply to us today. Is it really as simple as good things happen to good people?
That's where things get a little more nuanced, I think. Our source material seems to point to a deeper understanding of those blessings and curses.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, it's not just about material wealth or physical well-being. It's talking about a more holistic kind of flourishing, a concept that includes spiritual wholeness, peace, and a right relationship with God.
Okay, that makes sense. It's easy to get caught up in the tangible rewards.
Right.
But Deuteronomy seems to be saying that true blessing is so much more than that.
It's about aligning yourself with God's will and finding true fulfillment in that.
I love that. It's like finding your purpose within God's plan.
Exactly. Now let's dive into some of the specific details from the source material that really bring Deuteronomy to life.
Yes, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so one detail that stood out to me was the account of Israel's rebellion at Kadesh Barnea.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty pivotal moment.
Their lack of trust in God led to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness.
40 years. It's crazy how doubt and fear can hold us back, even when we're so close to something great.
It really is. It makes you wonder, what are our own Kadesh Barnea moments? You know, those times when we let doubt hold us back from stepping into God's promises?
That's such a good question. And here's another thought-provoking detail. Moses himself doesn't get to enter the promised land because of his own disobedience.
It's a tough lesson.
It really is. It's a reminder that we're all accountable to God, even the most faithful leaders.
No one is exempt from the consequences of their actions.
But you know, it's also a beautiful picture of God's grace.
How so?
Even when we mess up, God can still use our lives for his purposes, just like he used Moses to prepare the Israelites for their future.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let's not forget those vivid descriptions of blessings for obedience, either abundant crops, peace, victory. It really paints a picture of flourishing and wholeness.
It's like a glimpse of what's possible when we align our lives with God's will.
Absolutely. And then there are all those specific laws about daily life too, everything from caring for animals to maintaining purity.
It's fascinating to see how faith permeated every aspect of their society.
Right. It makes you think about how our faith influences our own daily lives. Is it compartmentalized or does it flow into everything we do?
That's a great question to reflect on. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Deuteronomy is like this rich tapestry of history, law, and wisdom, and we've only just begun to explore it.
I know, right? And I think what's really important to remember is that while some parts of Deuteronomy might feel distant or even irrelevant, the core message about love, obedience, and covenant is still so relevant today.
It speaks to our deepest longings as human beings, the need for connection, for purpose, for a life that matters.
Something worth thinking about, don't you think?
Definitely. It really is remarkable, isn't it, how this ancient text can speak so directly to our modern struggles.
I know, right? Like those longings for connection, purpose, a life that matters. It's all woven right into Deuteronomy.
Yeah, and remember how we talked about choosing between the path of blessing or the path of curse?
Right.
Deuteronomy encourages us to go deeper with that.
Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's not just about material wealth or avoiding negative consequences. It's about a deeper understanding of those blessings and curses, a kind of wholeness.
Okay, so it's not just about the external stuff.
Right. It's about flourishing in every sense of the word: spiritual, emotional, relational, the whole package.
I like that. And the source material talks about remembering as a key part of this flourishing.
Moses constantly reminds the Israelites to remember their history, the good, the bad, the moments of faithfulness and rebellion.
So it's more than just reminiscing about the good old days.
It's active engagement with the past. It's theologically significant, too.
Oh.
Well, remembering connects us to God's faithfulness throughout history. It strengthens our faith for the future.
So it's like we're tracing God's fingerprints on our lives.
Exactly. And when we recognize God's hand at work in the past, it fuels our trust in Him for the future.
That makes a lot of sense. And this idea of remembering kind of leads into another major theme, covenant renewal.
Yeah, Deuteronomy is essentially a reestablishment of the covenant God made with Israel at Mount Sinai.
It's like hitting the refresh button on their relationship.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that the covenant is about so much more than just rules and regulations.
Okay, so it's not just a legal contract.
It's a living relationship built on love, trust, mutual commitment.
A relationship with God at the center.
Right. It reflects God's desire to be in an intimate relationship with His people, to dwell with them.
And that brings us back to the Shema, doesn't it?
Full circle. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
It's like a call to wholehearted devotion.
Yeah, make God the center of everything.
It's easy to say, harder to do right. But Deuteronomy seems to be saying that when obedience flows from this place of love for God, it becomes less about rule following and more about joyful surrender.
It's about recognizing that God's ways are ultimately for our good, even when we don't understand them.
Trusting the process.
And remember, obedience isn't about achieving perfection.
It's about striving to align our lives with God's will.
Exactly. Knowing that we're going to stumble and make mistakes along the way, but we have His grace to help us.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And speaking of journeys, there's another interesting aspect of Deuteronomy.
What that?
The transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua.
Ah, yeah, such a bittersweet moment.
Moses leads the people for 40 years, but because of his disobedience...
He doesn't get to enter the promised land.
Right. It's a reminder that even the greatest leaders are accountable to God.
But it also shows God's faithfulness, raising up a new leader to guide them into this new chapter.
It's like passing the torch. God working through different individuals throughout history to accomplish his purposes.
I love that. And speaking of historical context, we have to acknowledge that some parts of Deuteronomy can be a little tough for modern readers.
Yeah, especially those laws about warfare and the treatment of surrounding nations.
They can be hard to reconcile with our modern understanding of justice and morality,
It's true, but it's important to approach those passages with humility.
recognizing that we're viewing them through a different lens.
Exactly. And even within those challenging passages, we can still find some timeless principles.
Like what?
Well, the emphasis on justice, even in the midst of war, reminds us that God cares about fairness and righteousness,
Okay.
and the laws regarding the treatment of the poor and vulnerable. Those highlight God's heart for compassion and mercy.
So it's about looking for those glimmers of God's character, even in the midst of difficult texts.
Trying to understand the heart behind the law and finding ways to apply those timeless principles to our own lives.
I love that. And in the midst of all this law and history, there's this really beautiful moment. Moses' final blessing on the tribes of Israel.
It's so moving, isn't it? Filled with encouragement and affirmation.
It's like he tailored it to the unique character and calling of each tribe.
And it reminds us that God knows each of us intimately.
He sees us and has a specific purpose for our lives.
We're all part of something bigger than ourselves.
Speaking of the bigger picture, Deuteronomy sits at this pivotal point in Israel's history. They're about to enter the Promised Land.
The fulfillment of God's promises.
It's a new beginning, a moment of transition.
Filled with both excitement and uncertainty.
And Deuteronomy is their guidebook, their reminder of the covenant that binds them to God. It's like a spiritual roadmap for them and for us too,
We're all on a journey
facing our own Promised Land.
with their own unique challenges and opportunities.
So the question is, will we trust God enough to follow his leading, even when the path ahead is unclear?
Will we choose the path of blessing?
Will we embrace that challenge to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength?
And let that love guide our steps.
Deuteronomy reminds us that these are the choices that shape our lives.
The choices that determine the tapestry of our journey.
Okay, so we've journeyed with the Israelites right to the edge of the Promised Land. We've explored this idea of covenant and, the weight of our choices. But how do we actually bridge that gap between this ancient text and, our modern lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's easy to get caught up in all the, historical details and kind of miss how it applies to us today.
Yeah, for sure. So, what are some practical ways that we can actually apply these timeless principles from Deuteronomy today?
Well, one of the most powerful takeaways for me is that emphasis on remembering God's faithfulness.
Oh, yeah. Moses was always telling the Israelites to remember their history.
Right, exactly. And just like them, we can benefit from, actively recalling how God has worked in our own lives.
It's like taking a spiritual inventory,
Yeah.
Not just listing our blessings, but really reflecting on those moments where we saw God's hand at work.
And sometimes we don't even recognize it at the time, right?
Totally. It's only later that we can look back and be like, oh, wow, God was there.
And those moments, they become like anchors for us,
Anchors.
Yeah, when we face challenges or doubts, we can look back and say, okay, God's been faithful before, even when things were tough. He'll be faithful again.
I love that. It's like we're building this foundation of trust brick by brick with each memory of God's faithfulness.
Yeah, and speaking of foundations, the Shema, that declaration of love for God.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength.
Right, it challenges us to make him the center of everything.
Not just in words, but in our actions too.
Exactly. It's about aligning our hearts, our minds, our actions with his will. It's about seeking his guidance in every decision.
That sounds pretty daunting.
It can be, but remember, obedience isn't about achieving some kind of, perfect score. It's about continually striving to align our lives with God's will and trusting that he's going to empower us through his grace.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to stumble, we're going to make mistakes, but we keep coming back to him, seeking his guidance.
Allowing his love to kind of lead us back to the path.
And speaking of journeys, remember how Moses passed the leadership torch to Joshua?
Oh, yeah.
It reminds us that we're part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
And we have a responsibility to invest in the next generation.
It's like we're all carrying this torch of faith, And it's our duty to pass it on to those who come after us.
Whether we're parents or mentors or friends or, whatever our role is, we can make a difference in someone else's faith journey.
Absolutely. It's about sharing our experiences, offering guidance, and most importantly, pointing people toward the love of God.
The love that sustained us.
Leaving a legacy that goes way beyond our own lifetime.
And we've kind of danced around this a bit, but let's address the elephant in the room. Some of the laws and practices in Deuteronomy, especially those surrounding, warfare and social justice, they can be really hard to stomach from our modern perspective.
Yeah, they can feel pretty jarring to our sensibilities.
So how do we make sense of those parts of the text?
Well, it's important to remember the cultural context of ancient Israel.
It was a very different time.
A very different time, and their understanding of justice and, morality was not the same as ours.
But even within those challenging passages,
Yeah.
we can still find principles that resonate with our own understanding of a loving and just God.
Like the emphasis on justice, even in the midst of war, reminds us that God cares about fairness and righteousness.
And those laws protecting the vulnerable, they highlight his heart for compassion and mercy.
Values that are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Deuteronomy, I'm just struck by, the sheer depth and complexity of this book.
It's really an incredible book.
It's got stories of rebellion and redemption laws that challenge us and blessings that inspire us. It really gives us this glimpse into God's heart.
And his unwavering desire for a relationship with us.
Even though we don't have, a Moses leading us through a literal wilderness, we still have that same faithful, loving God walking with us every step of the way.
Through every high and every low.
And just like the Israelites standing on the brink of the promised land, we have choices to make.
Will we trust God enough to step forward in faith?
Even when the way ahead seems unclear.
Will we embrace the challenge to love him with everything we've got?
And let that love shape our obedience and guide our steps.
These are questions worth pondering.
They really are. And Deuteronomy, with all its ancient wisdom and its enduring relevance, it gives us the tools and the inspiration to find our own answers.
So keep wrestling with those questions.
Keep seeking, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep trusting in the God who loves you more than you can imagine.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through Deuteronomy.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.
Deuteronomy begins with Moses reminding the Israelites of their journey and God's faithfulness. But how often do we forget the lessons from our own past? Reflect on the ways God has led you and provided for you. Are you living with gratitude for what he has done, or have you allowed forgetfulness to creep in? God calls us to remember his goodness and walk in his truth. If this resonates, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you remember and celebrate God's faithfulness today? Moses' call for the Israelites to obey God's commands in Deuteronomy reminds us that obedience is the key to living a blessed life. But how often do we try to define what's best for ourselves instead of trusting God's commands? Reflect on the areas of your life where God is calling you to obedience. Are you resisting his will, or are you surrendering to it? Trusting his wisdom leads to blessing. If you're ready to obey God's call, subscribe, like, and comment. Where is God calling you to obedience today? In Deuteronomy, Moses speaks of loving God with all our heart, soul, and strength. But do we love God with everything we have, or do we give him just a part of ourselves? Reflect on your love for God. Is it wholehearted, or are there areas of your life you're holding back from him? God desires our full devotion, not half-hearted commitment. If you're ready to love God with your whole heart, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you show God more love today? Deuteronomy reminds us of the importance of teaching our children about God's ways. But how often do we pass up opportunities to disciple the next generation? Reflect on the ways you are investing in the faith of those around you, whether children, friends, or others. Are you passing on God's truth to those who need it? If you're ready to be intentional about teaching others about God, subscribe, like, and comment. How are you investing in the next generation? In Deuteronomy, Moses warns the people against idolatry, urging them to keep their focus on God alone. But how easy is it to let other things take God's place in our hearts? Reflect on the idols in your life, things you've allowed to replace God's rightful place. What is competing for your devotion? God calls us to worship him alone. If you're ready to remove idols from your life, subscribe, like, and comment. What idols do you need to surrender to God? Deuteronomy emphasizes the importance of remembering God's covenant, a reminder that we are part of his eternal plan. But how often do we forget that we are heirs of his promises? Reflect on the covenant promises God has made to you. Do you live in the light of those promises, or do you doubt their validity? Remember, God is always faithful. If you're ready to trust in his promises, subscribe, like, and comment. Which of God's promises are you holding on to today? Moses' farewell speech in Deuteronomy urges the people to choose life and blessings through obedience. But how often do we choose the path of least resistance instead of the path of blessing? Reflect on your choices. Are they leading you toward the life God promises, or away from it? Choosing God's way always leads to life and peace. If you're ready to choose life today, subscribe, like, and comment. What choice do you need to make today to follow God's path? Deuteronomy closes with a final reminder that God is always with us, guiding us into His promises. Reflect on your own journey. Do you recognize God's presence in every step? The journey isn't always easy, but God is with us. Are you ready to step into all that He has promised you? If you're inspired to move forward with faith, subscribe, like, and comment. How can you trust God more fully as you walk into His promises? Share this with someone who needs to know God is always with them.